I made a bold claim in my Armored Core 6 review about how Fromsoftware single-handedly revived the mecha genre. And I just want to let you know that this wasn't just a hot take that I created for the purposes of clickbait. I 100% stand by that statement, and I feel like it's aged pretty well. And let me break it down. The success of the Souls games inspired plenty of imitators. Games like Lies of P, Neo, and Code Vein are all pretty good in their own regard. And you know you did something right when even Star Wars, one of the world's largest franchises, feels the need to imitate your gameplay loop. And I feel like the Souls-like genre is pretty well established in gaming as a whole. Armored Core 6 seems to have had that same sort of effect. It was a good game that communicated the appeal of mecha, but in a gaming context. And what even is the appeal of mecha? The appeal of mecha is fighting in 3 dimensions, both on the ground and in the air, with unrivaled customization options, including different weight classes, leg types that change your mobility, different weapon loadouts, RPG depth for every part and piece in the game, and who could forget the joy of looking at spreadsheets and Gunpla-like cosmetic options. And Armored Core 6 was both a critical and mainstream success among fans. And now Armored Core is starting to get into that imitation stage where different developers besides Fromsoftware are starting to take a crack at the genre again. At the Game Awards, Mecha Break burst into the scene and so far looks pretty awesome. Mecha Break looks like a more fast-paced and airborne version of Armored Core. And it looks right up my alley since I love fast-paced combat, and I kind of feel like we could use a more dedicated player versus player experience. While I do believe that Armored Core's PvP system is serviceable, it's completely secondary to the single-player campaign, and I feel like Armored Core would benefit a lot more from having a more fleshed out co-op system. But hey, that's just me. For gaming, Mecha offers developers more tools to explore fun gameplay concepts. There's a new freedom that was inevitable to explore, and I kind of feel like it's easier to sell the mecha premise in, let's say, gaming than movies and television. Let me break it down. For like 30 years, the mecha genre was a mainstream staple in anime and manga. You would get like 5 different mecha shows per year, and then it just suddenly kind of died out. And I can already hear you say that, hey, Gundam is still popular, so the mecha genre is alive and well. Well, let me tell you this, Gundam will always be popular. Ever since it spearheaded the real robot subgenre, Gundam has become a cultural staple that at this point in time is too big to fail, and it doesn't reflect the genre as a whole. It's like Pokemon at this point in time. It's immortal, and it's never gonna die. The health of a genre is based more off of how many imitators your most popular IP has. Like, you can't judge the health of the 3D platformer genre based off of how well Super Mario is doing. Mario will always do well. In the mid-2000s, Super Mario was killing it in 3D, but the rest of the genre was dead, with the exception of maybe Ratchet and Clank. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down how we can rebuild the mecha genre. I'm going to be getting into the appeal of mecha, how it can be uniquely used narratively, and how we can sell it to mass audiences. But before I get into how or why, I gotta get the shameless self-promotion. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the Gaming Grappler. The more this channel grows, the more time, effort, and dedication I can bring in to deliver you guys content on a consistent and regular basis. So with that being said, let's get into it. If we're going to save the mecha genre, we need to break down its core appeal to writers and how mecha can be used uniquely in a narrative. So let's take things right back to their basics. What even is a mech? A mech is a giant humanoid robot piloted from within. The idea came from Go Nagai, who needed an original concept to sell Mazinger Z. One day, while stuck in traffic, Go Nagai had an epiphany moment. Wouldn't it be cool if my car could just sprout legs and walk in front of traffic? And that mindset right there pretty much sums up the power fantasy aspect of mecha. A mech is the coolest car imaginable that gives you superpowers while you drive it. And just like superpowers, mechs allow characters that normally wouldn't have any relevance in a story to then take on a central role. A mech is a war machine that could theoretically be piloted by anybody. In your typical war story with on-the-ground combat, your protagonists are generally going to be young military-aged men with maybe a few older men sprinkled in leadership positions, since historically, these are the people who fought in wars. But since mechs are machines that need to be piloted from within, their effectiveness in combat and warfare scenarios is based solely on dexterity. Athleticism doesn't really factor into it. There is no advantage other than visual aesthetics to have your mech pilot look like a space marine. Any type of person can be a pilot. You could have male pilots and female pilots and have them be of any age bracket, both young and old alike. You could have a pilot be as young as 16 or as old as 80, and I'll have them be equally relevant in a war story. For example, a Top Gun Maverick, and I'm well aware that Tom Cruise is operating a jet, but narratively, it kind of functions the same way as a mech. It's a war machine that needs to be piloted from within. Tom Cruise in Top Gun Maverick is like 60 years old in that movie and outmaneuvers younger and stronger pilots, but my brain accepts it as being possible. But if he wasn't in an airplane, like let's say Tom Cruise was a soldier on the ground that was fighting younger, bigger, and stronger opponents and physically overpowering him, it would look ridiculous. But since he's a pilot, we could just accept that this is a skill he has that he's developed over his decades in service. But then that raises another question. Why not just use an airplane? What value do mechs even bring to the table? Well, let's get into it. War has changed. As technology has advanced, warfare has become impersonal. War is fought at a distance, and soldiers are killed with drone strikes or snipers they never seen coming from miles and miles away. And often the most cowardly tactics are the most effective tactics. War feels less like a battle between two opposing sides than a series of accidents orchestrated at a distance. And it didn't always used to be like that. Back in the year 334 BC, Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia, would himself lead his cavalry headfirst into battle. And believe it or not, he was actually one of the most effective military strategists of his time. He conquered from Greece all the way to the edge of India, and he did that all in his 20s. And my main point here is that some of the best fiction that has stood the test of time, like Homer's The Iliad or 300, were so entertaining and so good because they were over-exaggerated versions of real battles that have actually happened. As a matter of fact, I would argue that Alexander the Great's warfare and his life story is more entertaining than anything you could have possibly read from Game of Thrones. And the themes of those stories were amazing. Acts of courage and bravery were rewarded. A king leading headfirst into battle would actually strengthen the morale in the resolve of his army. But this type of storytelling doesn't translate one-to-one very well in the modern age. Leaders of today's countries often never know combat firsthand and just see it as death tolls and numbers on a spreadsheet. And in the modern age, or even in a future setting, heading guns blazing headfirst into battle will just get you killed by landmines or machine gun fire from miles and miles away. If you want to tell a story like Homer's The Iliad or 300 in a modern or future setting, you're going to need to set up some groundwork to make it work. The good news is that in a science fiction setting, you can easily write around this problem. Let's look at Frank Herbert's Dune, for example. In Dune, thanks to the shielding system, modern and long-ranged weaponry is less effective in Frank Herbert's story. As a matter of fact, the protagonists of Dune often have to resort to using hand-to-hand combat. And this is where mechs come in play. A mech serves the same sort of narrative function as Frank Herbert's shielding system. Since mechs are powerful war machines, they can allow a pilot to move faster and take more damage while still using both modern and classical weaponry alike. The human form of a mech allows people to fight in a more traditional sort of way. A mech can be outfitted with either swords and shields and still be effective since they're fast enough to dance around in the sky like they're fighter jets. Again, guns are still optional for a mecha loadout, but they're not an instant death sentence this time around. A mech can either move fast enough to dodge bullets and missiles or be tanky enough to eat them outright without dying. Basically, mecha offers, from a writing perspective, the best of both worlds. You can write your mecha pilot like they're a soldier from the Bronze Age, while still using modern and futuristic technology. You can write a character like Alexander the Great, put him in a mech, and suddenly he just works in a science fiction type of setting. Again, mecha is having your cake and eating it too. From a storytelling perspective, it allows you to tackle futuristic problems like nuclear warfare and what that does to a people, while still having your characters have themes from like 300 or the Iliad, where bravery and self-sacrifice are central themes to your main characters. And if you think that mecha is just a mindless power fantasy, you'd be sorely mistaken. While your protagonists are going to feel powerful, so are your antagonists. And a matter of fact, in most mecha stories I've seen, mechs are just standard military equipment. And just like the Incredibles quote, if everybody's super, nobody's super. There's also an innate vulnerability to being inside the cockpit of a giant robot. Again, think Top Gun. As powerful and as fast as your machine is, you're still just a fleshy human on the inside. Some of the most brutal deaths in mecha shows aren't even the ones you see on screen. It's the implication of one, like a cockpit death where you see a pilot just dying off screen. Again, you wouldn't be able to tell a story about bravery and self-sacrifice if there wasn't an innate danger. I feel like I've done a half-decent job of explaining how useful mechs are in a science fiction narrative, but I also kind of feel like modern audiences are going to have some barriers in their head that prevent them from accepting mecha as a premise. Mechs are not realistic in the slightest. Shocking, I know, but unfortunately, in our reality, there would be no real advantage to piloting a giant robot. A mech's humanoid form would be slow, both on the ground and in the air, and at such colossal sizes, they wouldn't even be physically possible. So a good mecha writer is going to need to maneuver their way around this in order to aid in the audience's suspension of disbelief here. And luckily, that's not as difficult as it seems. Remember, this is a fictional story, and the sky is the limit here in terms of options. A good mecha writer could say that their mech was created with some new fictional type of alloy, or powered by some new science fiction resource. Hell, you can even say screw it. In our universe, mechs operate on a different set of physics altogether. You could do anything, but what is important here is that you do something, because audiences are not going to accept mechs at a base level. Unfortunately, mechs not being realistic isn't the only barrier to entry that's preventing modern audiences from suspending their disbelief. We are now living in an age where artificial intelligence is becoming disgustingly powerful, and drones are starting to get used for everything. We're on the precipice of living in a world with driverless cars and airplanes. So needless to say, if mechs did exist, they would probably be operated by some kind of AI system. And even if they were piloted by a human being, they would probably be piloted remotely, thousands of miles away, safely in a bunker, while the pilot could just sit there eating Dorito chips. And narratively speaking, this is problematic because there's no real stakes to any of the drama with the mechs on display here. The reason why you want your mecha pilot to physically operate the giant robot from within is that it adds some stakes, some danger, and some real drama to everything that's happening. Once a pilot steps foot in the robot, the mech becomes an extension of their body, and there's a real possibility that they might end up dying. Remember, in order to tell a story with bravery and heroism, there has to be a very real and tangible sense of danger. So how do we get the pilot back in the robot? Well, there are a few narrative tricks we can go about doing this. We can go the Dune route and argue that in our future, in our universe, artificial intelligence is outlawed after a post-machine war, and that all technology is tactile and requires a human pilot. Let's say, for argument's sake, that in order for your mech to be piloted effectively, a human being's nervous system has to be directly wired to get it. Even if you could use it remotely, maybe the remote mechs have too much of a delay to be used effectively in combat situations. You could also argue that in the future, in your universe, automated systems might no longer be trusted after being turned against their creators. Like, imagine how much of a burn it would be if your entire military was decimated and hacked by the drones you created yourself. It would be such a burn, and a good argument to go back to having pilots and soldiers take the front lines once again. Again, I'm not saying anything new, but just giving a helping hand about how a modern writer can justify the mecha premise to a new audience that might not be receptive to it. With that being said, I feel like I've laid out a pretty good foundation in this video. I feel like I've explained the power fantasy and the appeal of mecha, how it can be used uniquely in a narrative, and how you can make what's old new again, how you can take Bronze Age stories like the Iliad and reinvent them for a sci-fi setting by using mecha as a plot device and a vehicle to have futuristic pilots fight like an old school type of way. And I've also given you guys some good tips about how you can justify the mecha premise to a modern audience that might not like it as much. So with that being said, hopefully we can rebuild and revive the mecha genre.